Greetings everyone, and welcome to Lucas Brews. In today's video we're going to be weathering the 1/72 scale Zvezda Panther Ausf D. Previously I've done a painting video and also a build video, so if you haven't seen those, go check them out before having a watch of this one. I begin the weathering process by applying some XF16 flat aluminium with a fine brush onto some of the raised areas on the road wheels and the sprocket to create some metal chipping. I focus on the teeth of the sprocket and the raised rivets and bolts, which would likely get scratched during maintenance or as the tracks are moving. Once it's dried, I then apply some Tamiya black panel liner over all of the road wheels and the sprocket and idler to highlight their details and also add a little bit of a shading effect to darken them up. I let the panel liner dry and then use the sprue cutters to remove the plastic tracks from their sprue, and once the wheels have fully dried, I start to line up the pins and bend the track to the correct shape. I found the tracks were a little bit tricky to bend, however they were much better at holding their shape than the rubber band tracks, and they also didn't put as much tension on the road wheels. I found the idler wheel also fitted very nicely, and all the road wheels and their pins lined up perfectly with the tracks. However, the drive sprocket's teeth appeared to be slightly too large to fit into the holes on the tracks, so as a result the sprocket didn't fit very nicely, which then caused the entire structure to put a lot of strain on the suspension arms, as I'd find out later. Overall though, the assembly of the running gear was relatively simple and the structure is quite nice and solid, and I've definitely found it a lot easier to do than the rubber tracks and more realistic. Moving back to the hull and turret, I painted the exhausts X31 titanium gold using a fine brush, and then I applied a little bit of metal chipping onto the actual tank. I used the same dry brushing technique to apply the chipping to the turret and hull as I did with the road wheels. I focus on the areas such as the corners and edges of the turret and the hull, which are more exposed to getting chipped, areas where the maintenance crew would likely to be working, such as on the exposed bolts and also on various access hatches, the areas especially on the turret and around the driver and the radio operator's hatches where the crew are likely to walk on the tank, and also on the corners of vents and other areas that are likely to get chipped. Next I apply a pin wash using Tamiya's black panel liner scent over the entire of the tank to help highlight the details, since it will flow into the gaps and all of the nice recessed areas, such as all of the welding marks, the edges of the hatches and access ports, and also all of the nice details. It also adds a little bit of a black kind of dirty effect, especially for the engine deck, which looks a little bit like some oil and grease have built up over time. Once the panel liner is fully dry, I use a cotton tip and some enamel thinners to remove the excess panel liner out of some of the larger areas where there is less recessed details, to help lighten up the tank just a little bit and also help the panel liner flow even more into just the gaps. One of the advantages of using the acrylic paints to paint the camouflage on the tank is that it won't respond to the thinners which are used for the enamel pin washes, which is a nice little trick. If you've painted with enamel, you can seal it in with a little bit of varnish before you do some panel liner. I then use a cocktail stick to apply some Vallejo mud and grass effects into the areas on the underside of the hull and in between the suspension, where a lot of dirt and grass often builds up in tanks since it's very difficult to remove, and it's also quite a prone area to getting dirty. On tanks such as the Panther, which have very large road wheels which block the sides of the hull and make it difficult to access for weathering, I find it easier to apply the mud and grass effects before attaching the tracks and the road wheels, hence why I built them separately and then glued them on later once I'd applied the mud and grass. The fit of the tracks was okay. It's probably a little bit better to have not done what I did and build them on the tank rather than build them as a unit and then glue them on, because I found that they put a lot of strain on the suspension arms, and if you're not careful you can very easily snap them off and then it's very difficult to apply the tracks. They also seem to stick out just a tiny bit, but this isn't hugely noticeable. With the main assembly of the tank completed, it was time to add on the accessories. The first of which were the side skirts, which I'd painted separately in the base buff colour. I decided to do them a little bit beaten up, so I used a pair of side cutters to cut them into sections and also to give them a little bit of damage from being bent. This was quite common to find on Panther tanks, as the side skirts were only relatively thin sheets of metal which were designed to stop anti-tank rifle bullets. However, they were quite prone to getting torn off either during battle due to getting shot at, or possibly even just as the tank was driving along they could either fall off or get torn on something. Once they'd been glued into position, I then painted on the camouflage markings over the top of the buff, using both the chocolate brown and the refractive green I used on the hull and the turret. The reason I did this after gluing them onto the tank was to help line up the camouflage markings so that it looked like it had all been done at once. Once the red, brown and the green had been painted onto the side skirts, I then left them to dry and painted the vision slits for the commander's cupola with some X1 gloss black from Tamiya. I then went over the side skirts with a coat of buff in the same way I'd done with the hull and the turret to soften the camouflage colours a little bit. The tracks then received a dusting of mud and grass effects from Vallejo to make it look like there was some stuff caught up in them, and then I used a dry brushing technique and a bit of foam to apply some metal chipping onto the edges of the side skirts. They also received a coat of panel liner, much as I'd done with the hull, which was then wiped off with a bit of thinner once it had dried. I then applied some mud and grass onto the side skirts themselves, which would likely receive a fair bit of crap from the running gear, and then it was time to use the Tamiya weathering master sets. I used these water-based pigments to create first some rusting effects on the exhaust and some of the metal chips around the sides of the vehicle, and then a little bit of the black weathering effect to add some gun smoke and exhaust stains on the exhaust and the muzzle brake. I also apply them using a fair bit of water and a small brush streaking down the side of the vehicle to create some dirt effects, and as it's drying I mix a little bit more water with either a cotton tip or the small brush and wipe the excess away. I might also sometimes use my fingers. Some of the darker and lighter shades of sand and dirt were also applied onto the road wheels themselves, and on the rear surface of the engine deck and on the sides of the turret, and especially on the roof of the turret, which would likely receive a fair bit of dirt from both the crew and also just generally settling on top of the vehicle. The good thing about the weathering powders is they can either be applied dry to create a dry brushing effect, or you can mix a fair bit of water with them to help make the effect much thicker and then remove the excess. The last thing to do was to attach some of the final accessories and give them a little bit of weathering as well. I'd painted most of them on the sprue, using mainly XF16 flat aluminium for things such as the spare track links and the tow ropes and tools, and I'd painted them a little bit more once they were attached to the tank. This included a little bit of Tamiya flat earth onto the wooden parts of the tools and the box, a bit of RLM grey for the fire extinguisher and the jack on the back of the tank, and various shades of red, brown and also the Tamiya rusting powders to create a rustic effect on the spare track links. And once I was happy with the paint on the accessories, I gave them a little bit of panel liner to darken them and highlight their details, and with that, the model of the Zvezda Panther tank was finally completed. So, having finally built the Zvezda Panther for the second time in my life, I have to say I am still a pretty big fan of this kit. The details on it are really quite nice, especially considering a lot of the components are simplified. Overall, the fit of the parts is really good. The only troubles I had with it were the tracks. I find that although the tracks don't have any gaps and all the details are really nicely molded, especially considering how simplified the running gear is on this, when in most German tanks you would have individual road wheels that you have to paint and glue, it's a lot nicer to have them all molded as one piece as they are in this kit. However, aside from that, the sprocket wheels didn't seem to fit very well, and they were also very, very delicate, and they didn't seem to mesh very well with the tracks. I'll try and have a few pictures to kind of illustrate how they didn't really go into them. And the worst part is that I found once I'd built it as a sub-assembly and then glued it onto the tank, it was putting a lot of pressure on the suspension arms, which are only really delicate little pins of plastic. So it's definitely good for beginners in terms of it being not too expensive and relatively simple. It's fun to return to as a mojo build if you want something that's not going to have all the hatches open and all the excessive detail done, but just something nice and little to do. Or if you're a wargamer looking for a few tanks that aren't too difficult to put together but still have some really great details and are in 72nd scale, it's a good tank for you. Thank you very much for having a watch of this video, and I do hope you enjoyed it and the other two videos in this series. Be sure to let me know what you thought of it in the comment section below, and please feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy my content and want to support me. And speaking of support, I'd like to give a big shout out to my wonderful patrons who have been helping me fund these videos and also my animations. If you want to go check out my Patreon page, I'll leave a little link in the description. And also a shout out to Tectonic Hobbies, the local store on the Sunshine Coast. Feel free to pop in if you want to have a little chat about all things to do with modelling. Thanks again, and until the next video, model on!